Evelyn Harper slammed her last 6 loaves onto the counter of Harlan's general store and said, "I'll trade you bread for passage north." The man behind the counter looked her up and down her wide hips, her flour-dusted dress, her worn-out boots, and laughed. Not a small laugh. A loud, rolling, ugly laugh that brought 2 other men to the doorway, just to see what was funny. Evelyn didn't flinch. She picked up every single loaf, tucked them under her arm, and walked out the door without another word. She had stopped waiting for people to be decent a long time ago. If this story moves you, please subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end, because what happens next will remind you that the most powerful thing a woman can do is keep showing up. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The road out of Millhaven ran straight and mean through the flatlands, and Evelyn Harper walked every inch of it with 6 loaves of bread pressed against her ribs like they were the last things tethering her to this earth. Because they were. She'd baked them before dawn in the kitchen of the boarding house where she'd rented a cot for 2 nights, using the last of the flour she'd carried in her satchel, all the way from Crestfield. Before Crestfield, she'd come from Dunmore. Before Dunmore from the farm she and Robert had built with their own hands over 11 years. The farm that the bank had swallowed whole 6 months after Robert's funeral, while the soil was still cracked from the drought that had killed everything they'd planted. She wasn't walking toward anything in particular. That was the truth she didn't say out loud. She told people she was heading north toward the river towns, where a woman who could bake might find steady work in a hotel kitchen or a boarding house. That sounded like a plan. It sounded like purpose. But the real truth, the one that lived in her chest at 3 in the morning when she couldn't sleep, was that she was just walking because stopping felt like dying. The sun was a flat white hammer overhead, and the dust the road kicked up coated the back of her throat. She'd drunk the last of her water 2 miles back. Her feet had stopped hurting about a mile ago, which she knew from experience meant they'd gone numb, which meant the blisters had opened again. She didn't look down. Looking down never helped anything. She heard the children before she saw the house. It wasn't crying exactly. Not the sharp, urgent cry of a child in sudden pain. It was something lower than that. Something that had been going on a long time. A sound worn smooth by repetition, like a river stone. The kind of crying that has given up expecting anyone to come. Evelyn stopped walking. The house sat about 100 yards off the road, half hidden behind a scrub oak that had somehow survived the drought. It was a working ranch house, or it had been once. She could see the shape of ambition in its structure, the wide porch, the solid roofline. But the porch boards were warping, and the garden plot along the south wall was nothing but cracked earth and dead stalks. A fence post had fallen, and nobody had stood it back up. The front door was shut despite the heat. She stood there on the road for a long moment listening. Every sensible instinct she had told her to keep walking. She was a woman alone on a strange road carrying the only food she had. She did not know these people. She did not know what was on the other side of that door. She had walked into enough cold receptions in the last 6 months to know that a strange woman showing up uninvited was rarely welcomed, and she was not a small woman. Not an easy woman to dismiss as harmless, and people who were frightened or desperate or proud did unpredictable things. She knew all of that. She turned off the road anyway. The walk up to the house felt longer than it was. The crying didn't stop. If anything, it grew clearer as she got closer, and now she could separate it into at least 2 voices, maybe 3. Young voices. The youngest one barely more than a whimper. She stepped up onto the porch and knocked. Silence. Then the sound of quick movement feet on a wood floor. Something being set down or hidden. Then nothing. She waited. "I can hear you in there," she said. She kept her voice level and plain. "I'm not here to cause trouble. My name is Evelyn Harper. I'm a baker and I've got bread. That's all." More silence. She was about to knock again when the door opened 3 inches and stopped. The girl who looked out at her was 13, maybe 14, with dark circles under eyes that were far too old for her face. Her hair was pulled back in a braid that had come most of the way undone. She was holding the door with both hands braced, like she expected Evelyn to try to push through it. "We don't need anything," the girl said. "What's your name?" Evelyn asked. The girl's jaw tightened. "Emma. Emma." Evelyn said it quietly, like the name was worth saying right. "How many of you are in there?" Emma's eyes cut to the bread under Evelyn's arm and came back up fast like she was angry at herself for looking. "That's not your business." "You're right," Evelyn said. "It's not. But I heard crying, and I've got 6 loaves of bread, and I'm going to be honest with you, I can't walk away from a sound like that. I tried. I was already down the road." She paused. "I'm not asking to come in. I'm not asking for anything. I just want to leave the bread." Emma stared at her. There was something working behind those tired eyes, some calculation that a 13-year-old girl ought not to know how to do. She was measuring risk. She was deciding whether the woman on the porch was a threat worth the cost of turning away what was under her arm. "My papa said not to open the door for strangers," Emma said. "Your papa sounds like a smart man," Evelyn said. "Where is he?" "Working." Emma's chin lifted. "He works every day." "I know he does." Evelyn didn't know any such thing, but she said it like she did, like it was a fact she respected. "I can see it in how this place is kept up. He's trying hard." She held out one loaf. Just one. "Let me leave this on the porch rail. Nobody has to open any door." Emma looked at the loaf. The crying behind her had gone softer, aware that something was happening. "Emma." A smaller voice from somewhere inside the dark of the house. "Emma. Who is it?" "Nobody," Emma called back, not taking her eyes off Evelyn. Then after a beat quieter, "How do I know it ain't bad bread?" Evelyn pulled the loaf back, broke off a piece from one end and ate it. She chewed, swallowed, and held the rest out again. Emma opened the door. The inside of the house hit Evelyn like a fist. Not because it was dirty, it wasn't. Somebody had been trying to keep it clean, but because of what was missing. The smell of food. Any food. The cupboard by the door stood open and empty. The table had been pushed to the side, and on the floor in the corner, 3 children sat in a tight cluster. A boy, about 10, a girl, maybe 7, and a tiny one, she couldn't age exactly, a little boy, who'd gone quiet when the door opened and was now watching her with eyes so large they seemed to take up half his face. Emma stepped in front of them instinctively. "Easy," Evelyn said. She didn't move past the threshold. "I'm not coming in unless you invite me. Those are your people, and that's right that you're standing between them and me." Something flickered in Emma's expression. Not softness, she wasn't ready for softness, but a loosening of something coiled very tight. "You can come in," Emma said, like it cost her something. Evelyn came in. She set the bread on the table without ceremony. She didn't make a production of it, didn't say anything meant to make anyone feel grateful or small. She just set it down, the way she would have set it down in her own kitchen. Like bread on a table was a normal thing that happened in normal houses. "Can I use that knife?" she asked Emma, nodding toward the small blade on the shelf. Emma got it for her. Evelyn began slicing. "What are your names?" the older boy answered before Emma could stop him. "I'm Daniel, that's Ruth, and that's Luke." He pointed at the tiny one who was still watching Evelyn with those enormous eyes. "Daniel, Ruth, Luke," Evelyn repeated. "Good, strong names." She set a slice in front of each of them. "Emma." She looked up. "Sit down." Emma sat, like she'd forgotten for a moment that she was supposed to be suspicious. They ate. They didn't grab or rush, and that told Evelyn something. These children had been raised right. They had manners, even when they were starving, which meant somebody had put real time into them. But the speed at which the bread disappeared told the rest of the story. Emma took small bites. Deliberate, controlled bites, trying not to show how hungry she was, trying to be the one who held herself together. It was the little one, Luke, who undid Evelyn entirely. He took his piece of bread and held it in both hands for a long moment, before he ate any of it, just held it, like he needed to be sure it was real. Then he looked up at her, this tiny boy with dark circles and flour dust on his chin, and said, "Thank you, ma'am." His voice was barely a sound. Evelyn looked down at the table and pressed her jaw together hard. "You're very welcome, Luke," she said when she trusted her voice again. They heard the horse before any of them saw anything hoofbeats on the packed dirt outside, a single horse moving at a tired walk. Emma was on her feet before the sound fully registered, and the change that moved through her was so fast and total that Evelyn barely tracked it. The slumped-fed child was gone, replaced in half a second by the braced, watchful guardian. Her whole body shifted. Her shoulders came up, her chin lifted. "That's Papa," she said. And then to Evelyn, with everything that had just happened in the last 20 minutes suddenly receding behind a wall, "He doesn't like strangers." "I gathered," Evelyn said. She stood up from the table, brushed the crumbs from her dress, and put her hands where they could be seen. The door opened. Cole Bennett was not a large man, but he took up the whole doorway. He had the kind of leanness that comes from real work, from days that start before sunrise and end after dark, and he wore it like it had been pressed into him over years. His hat came off as he crossed the threshold, reflex habit. The last piece of manners a man holds on to when everything else has worn down, and then he saw Evelyn and stopped. His eyes went to her, then to the children, then to the bread on the table, then back to her. The whole circuit took about 2 seconds, and by the end of it, his face had closed up like a shutter snapping shut. "Emma," he said. His voice was quiet. That particular quiet that is not calm. "Who is this?" "Her name is Evelyn Harper, Papa." Emma's voice was steady. She had bread. The little ones were hungry. Cole's eyes didn't move off Evelyn. "I can see that." He set his hat on the peg by the door with a deliberate motion, like he was giving himself a second to decide how he wanted to handle this. "Ma'am, I don't know what you were told or what brought you to this door, but we don't take charity." "I didn't offer charity," Evelyn said. She kept her voice exactly as level as his, no higher, no lower. "I offered bread to hungry children. There's a difference." "The difference being what exactly?" "Charity asks something back," Evelyn said. "Even if it's just gratitude, I didn't ask these children for a thing." Cole's jaw moved. He looked at Emma. "She come to the door on her own?" "Yes, sir." Emma paused. "She ate the bread herself first, so we knew it was good." Something shifted in Cole's face at that, so small, Evelyn almost missed it. He looked back at her. "What do you want?" he said. Flat. Direct. "Nothing from you," Evelyn said. "I heard crying from the road. I couldn't keep walking. That's the whole of it." And now I was about to leave. She picked up her satchel from the floor beside the table. "I'll leave what's left of the bread. It's yours. I made it, I decide what to do with it, and I'm deciding to leave it here." Cole said nothing. He was watching her the way a man watches something he hasn't categorized yet, with a kind of stillness that wasn't hostility exactly, but wasn't welcome either. He was thinking. "You said your name was Harper," he said finally. "Evelyn Harper, out of Crestfield originally. My husband Robert and I had a farm outside of town. He passed 14 months ago. The bank took the land 6 months after." She said it plainly without decoration. It was just the facts of her life. She was not asking him to feel anything about them. "I've been working my way north since then. Baking when I can find a kitchen, walking when I can't." Cole was quiet for a long moment. Luke had climbed down from the bench and was standing about 3 feet from Evelyn, looking up at her with that same wide, wordless attention. "Luke," Cole said. "Come here, son." Luke walked to his father and leaned against his leg, but he kept his eyes on Evelyn. "Papa," Luke said very quietly. "Yeah, buddy." "She's nice." Cole looked down at his son for a long beat. Then he looked up at Evelyn, and whatever had been shut behind his face shifted, not open, not warm, but something tight released by one notch. "You eaten?" he said. "I'm fine," Evelyn said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. He was looking back at her with that same flat, careful expression, and there was nothing in it she could read as pity. It was just a question. A direct question from a man who asked direct questions. "No," she said, "I haven't." He pulled out the bench at the head of the table with one hand. "Then sit down, Mrs. Harper." He moved to the shelf along the wall and pulled down a tin that she would have bet was empty. It wasn't. There were a few pieces of dried jerky in the bottom of it, and he set them on the table without comment. "Emmy, get the water jug." Emma moved. And for just a moment, just a flicker, the line of the girl's shoulders went down a fraction, like something she'd been holding up for a long time had found briefly somewhere else to rest. Evelyn sat down at Cole Bennett's table. Outside, the sun was beginning to drop behind the ridge, and the long light came through the single west-facing window and lay across the floor in a wide orange bar. Daniel said something to Ruth in a low voice, and she giggled, quickly muffled. Luke climbed back onto the bench beside Evelyn, close enough that his arm was touching hers, and picked up the last piece of his bread and held it out to her. "You can have some of mine," he said. Very serious. Very small. Evelyn looked at the bread in his outstretched hand, at his face, at the absolute sincerity of him. She heard Cole make a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite anything, but something that was the ghost of one, and she did not trust herself to look at him. She broke off the smallest piece of Luke's offering and accepted it with both hands, the way you accept something precious. "Thank you, Luke," she said. "You're welcome, ma'am," he said, and ate the rest himself. Across the table, Cole Bennett watched the woman his son had decided to trust, and he said nothing, and he did not ask her to leave. Evelyn slept that night on the floor beside the cold hearth, wrapped in a horse blanket Emma had brought without being asked. She hadn't intended to stay. She'd meant to eat the jerky, drink the water, thank Cole Bennett for his table, and get back on the road before dark. But Luke had fallen asleep sitting upright on the bench with his head against her arm, and she hadn't been able to move without waking him. And by the time Cole had carried the boy to bed, the sky outside was the color of ink, and Cole had come back to the main room and said without looking at her, "Road's not safe after dark. Floor's yours if you want it." Then he'd gone to his room and shut the door. She lay there in the dark, listening to the house breathe around her, and told herself she'd be gone by sunrise. She was still there at noon the next day. How? Not because Cole asked her to stay. He didn't. He was up and out before she opened her eyes, and the only sign he'd been in the kitchen at all was a tin cup of water sitting on the table next to a cold biscuit so hard it could have been used to drive fence posts. She ate it without complaint. It was honest food made by a man doing his best, and she'd learned in the last 14 months not to have opinions about honest food. Emma was awake, sitting at the table with a piece of paper in front of her, covered in numbers. She looked up when Evelyn stirred, and her expression ran through about 4 different calculations in the time it took Evelyn to sit up. "Papa does the accounts at night," Emma said, like she was explaining why the paper was there, not like she was inviting conversation. Evelyn looked at the numbers from where she sat. Even upside down and at distance, she could see the problem: the columns didn't balance, and whoever had taught Emma arithmetic had gotten her most of the way there, but not all. The girl was working a subtraction wrong, carrying numbers that shouldn't be carried. "You've got a borrowing error in the 3rd column," Evelyn said. Emma's jaw tightened. "I know what I'm doing." "I know you do," Evelyn said. "But the 3 borrows from the 4, which makes the 4 A3, and you carried it like it was still a 4. Silence. Emma looked at the paper, looked at it for a long moment. "Show me," she said, like it hurt to say. Evelyn sat down beside her and showed her. That was how the day started. That was how most things started with Emma. One small concession that cost her something, one door opened by exactly 1 inch, and Evelyn learning to walk through it sideways without making a sound. By mid-morning, she'd found where the garden tools were kept and taken stock of the dead plot along the south wall. 2 of the beds were genuinely gone. The soil had cracked so deep that nothing short of a full turn and 2 weeks of water would bring it back. But the 3rd bed, the one closest to the house wall, where a rusted pipe dripped a slow and steady leak, had moisture 6 inches down. She could feel it when she pushed the handle of the trowel in. Something could grow there. Not much and not fast, but something. She was on her knees in the dirt, working the soil loose, when Ruth appeared at her elbow. "What are you doing?" Ruth was 7 and had the direct, unfiltered gaze of a child who had been serious for too long. "Seeing what's still alive," Evelyn said. Ruth crouched down and looked at the soil with the same focused attention. "Papa said the garden died." "Your papa's right about most of it, but this part." Evelyn tapped the corner of the bed. "This part still got some fight in it." Ruth was quiet, considering this with great seriousness. Then she said, "Are you going to stay?" Evelyn sat back on her heels. The question was plain as anything, no edge to it, just a child asking a simple and enormous thing. "I don't know," Evelyn said, which was the truth. Ruth looked at her for another moment. Then she picked up the trowel Evelyn had set down and started digging with it, no further discussion required. Like the answer didn't matter as much as what they were doing right now. They were still at it when Cole came back at midday. He pulled up his horse and looked at the two of them in the garden for a long moment. Evelyn could feel him looking. She didn't stop what she was doing. "That bed's been dead since April," he said. "The corner isn't," Evelyn said. "There's a leak in that pipe that's been keeping the soil damp. You've got about 4 square feet of workable ground here. Enough for greens, maybe some late-season root vegetables if we move fast." Cole got down from the horse slowly. He came over and crouched at the edge of the bed and put his hand into the soil, the way she'd done, pressing down until he hit the moisture. He stayed like that for a moment. "I'll be damned," he said quietly. Not to her, just to the fact of it. "Language, Papa," Emma called from the porch. Cole stood up. He looked at Evelyn like he was reassessing something. Like a number he'd added wrong was coming out different now that he'd checked it. "Where'd you learn to read soil?" 11 years of farming," Evelyn said. "You learn or you lose." He nodded once. Slowly. The way a man nods when he has nothing to argue with. He took his horse to the barn without another word. But he didn't tell her to stop. She took that as permission to keep going. The days found their shape on their own without anyone planning them. Evelyn baked in the mornings. Cole had flour in a sack in the back room that he'd been hoarding without knowing what to do with it. And once she found it and asked his permission, she used a portion each day and stretched it carefully. The smell of bread in the house did something to the atmosphere that she couldn't explain, but could feel it was like a key turning in a lock. The children moved differently in a house that smelled like baking. They spoke more. Ruth started humming to herself, small, tuneless sounds while she swept. Daniel began finishing sentences instead of trailing off. Cole didn't comment on any of it, but he stopped coming in from the barn with that shut-off endurance walk that she'd noticed the first night. He came in more slowly, like he was giving himself a moment before he came through the door. 3 days after she'd arrived, she found the account books. Not snooping, she'd been looking for a pencil for Emma's arithmetic lesson and had opened the wrong drawer. The books were in a battered leather cover, 3 of them, and she wouldn't have looked twice, except that the top one had fallen open, and she saw the numbers before she could stop herself. She shut the drawer. She sat with what she'd seen for the rest of the morning. At lunch, she waited until Emma had taken the younger children outside, and then she said, "Mr. Bennett, the account book's in the left drawer." Cole went still. "I wasn't looking for them," she said. "I was looking for a pencil. I saw the top page before I could stop myself. I shut the drawer." She paused. "I'm not going to pretend I didn't see what I saw." Cole set his fork down. "Mrs. Harper, you're 3 months behind on the grazing fee," she said quietly and directly. "And whoever holds your note on the equipment loan has been adding penalty interest. If that number in the bottom right corner is current, you've got about 40 days before it becomes a number you can't work your way out of from ranch wages alone." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Cole's face had gone to stone, and there was something moving behind it that was not anger, or not only anger, it was the look of a man who has been carrying something alone for so long that having someone else see it was its own kind of violence. "That's my business," he said. "Yes, it is," Evelyn said. "I'm not asking you to make it mine. I'm telling you what I saw. And I'm telling you I know numbers because I ran a farm's books for 11 years, and I know what 40 days looks like. She folded her hands on the table. Do with that what you want. Cole looked at her for a long, hard moment. Then he looked at the table. Then he got up, went to the drawer, and took out the books. He set them on the table in front of her without a word. She opened the top one and started from the beginning. It took her 2 hours to work through all 3 books, and Cole sat across from her the whole time, not speaking, not leaving, just sitting with his coffee gone cold in front of him. When she finished, she set the pencil down and laid out what she'd found. The grazing fee can be restructured, she said. I've seen it done. You go to Aldrich before he comes to you. You offer partial payment now and a written schedule for the rest. Most creditors will take it over the cost of pursuit. The equipment note is harder. That interest clause is punishing. But if you pick up 2 more fence contracts before the end of summer, you can service it. You'd have to work every daylight hour. I already work every daylight hour, Cole said. I know. She looked at him directly. But right now, you're working every daylight hour and losing ground. If you can add 2 contracts and cut the household spending by 1/3 for 60 days, you can stop the bleeding. Cole was quiet. He looked at the books spread open between them. He looked like a man who had been told something he already knew, but needed to hear out loud before he could act on it. Cut spending by 1/3, he repeated. You've already cut it most of the way there, Evelyn said. I've seen your pantry. You know better than I do what you've been doing without. Something crossed his face at that fast raw and gone before she could name it. But she'd seen it, the shame of it. The specific burning shame of a man who cannot feed his children. The bread I've been baking, she said carefully. That's coming out of what you already had in the back room. I'm not adding to your cost, Mr. Bennett. I want you to know that. He looked at her. A long look. Cole, he said. She waited. You can call me Cole. She nodded. Cole. She began closing the books. Let me recopy these into a clean ledger. Your columns are hard to follow because you were taught to account one way and you've been improvising another way on top of it. If I rewrite it clean, you'll be able to see where you stand at a glance. An hour's work. That's all. Cole reached out and put his hand flat on the top book before she could close it. Not stopping her, just resting there. His hand was wide and weathered and covered in small white scars. She recognized as wire cuts the particular badge of fence work. Why are you doing this? He said, not hostile, genuinely asking with the honest bewilderment of a man who had not had someone show up for him in a very long time. Evelyn thought about answering the way she would have answered anyone with something practical, something that kept distance between the question and the truth. She was good at that. She'd been doing it for 14 months. Instead, she said, because Luke offered me the last piece of his bread, and I haven't been able to leave since. Cole looked at her. Whatever he'd expected her to say, it wasn't that. He took his hand off the book. He stood up, walked to the door, and stopped with his back to her. Supper's on me tonight, he said. I can hunt. He walked out. Evelyn sat alone at the table with the account books in front of her, and the afternoon light coming through the window, and she pressed her fingers against the surface of the worn leather cover and breathed. Out in the yard, she could hear Ruth singing that tuneless song, and Daniel's voice rising and falling in some argument or story he was telling to no one in particular. And somewhere farther out, Cole's footsteps crossing toward the barn. Emma came back inside and stopped when she saw Evelyn's face. You all right? Emma said. Yes, Evelyn said. Emma looked at the account books. She looked at Evelyn. The calculation behind her eyes was different from the one she'd been running since the first moment. Slower, more careful. He showed you the books, Emma said. Yes. He's never shown anybody the books. Emma said it without inflection. Pure fact. Evelyn didn't say anything. She opened the top ledger and picked up the pencil. Emma sat down across from her, pulled Ruth's unfinished arithmetic toward herself, and worked on it without another word. They sat like that together, the woman and the girl both bent over numbers in the afternoon heat, the sounds of the house and the yard settling around them like weather. That evening, Cole came back with a brace of rabbits and cleaned them on the porch without being asked, and handed them through the door to Evelyn like it was something they'd arranged. Like there was already a system between them, like she had always been the one standing at that kitchen shelf, and he had always been the one hunting for their table. She took the rabbits and said nothing, because some things don't need words to be understood. Luke sat on the kitchen floor and watched her cook with the focused, reverent attention of a child watching something important happen. And when the smell filled the house, he pressed both hands to his own chest and closed his eyes like he was trying to hold it in. "That smells like Mama used to," he said. The whole room went quiet. Cole, who had come in and was washing at the basin, stopped moving. Emma, setting the table, stopped moving. Daniel looked at the floor. Ruth looked at Luke. Luke opened his eyes and looked at Evelyn without any apology or awareness that he'd said something enormous. Just a child stating a fact. Evelyn looked back at him. Her throat had closed completely. "Your mama must have been a real good cook," she said when she could. "She was the best," Luke said with total certainty. And then after a beat, with a sidelong look up at her, "But you're almost as good." Ruth burst into a giggle she immediately tried to smother. Daniel's mouth twitched, and Cole, standing at the basin with his back to the room, made that sound again, the one that was the ghost of a laugh, the one that meant something was still alive in him that he'd thought was gone. Evelyn turned back to the stove. She kept her back to the room until she was sure her face was her own again. She rewrote the account books that night by lamplight, and she did it so cleanly and so thoroughly that when Cole picked them up the next morning before heading out, he stood at the table for a full minute, just reading. Turning pages, slowly, his thumb running down the new columns, like he was checking the work of someone he didn't fully trust yet. Then he set the books down and said without looking up, "You missed your calling, Mrs. Harper." She told him her calling had always been bread and soil, and he said those weren't bad callings, and walked out. It was the longest voluntary conversation they'd had, and it lasted maybe 30 seconds, and Evelyn stood in the kitchen afterward, feeling something she hadn't felt in over a year. Something that resembled very distantly being seen. The market day came the following Saturday. Cole needed to go into Millhaven to sell 2 weeks of repair work receipts at the land office and pick up a spool of wire from the hardware store, and Emma had made a list of things they needed: salt cornmeal, a new whetstone, and Evelyn had looked at the list and added 3 items in her own handwriting at the bottom: baking soda, dried beans, and a small paper of pepper. Cole hadn't said anything about the additions. He'd folded the list and put it in his pocket, and when he'd gone to hitch the wagon, he'd looked back at the house and said, "Might as well all come. Children haven't been to town in a while." Emma had looked at Evelyn with an expression that was hard to read. "He hasn't taken us to town in 4 months," Emma said quietly once Cole was out of earshot. "Well," Evelyn said, "he's taking you now." The wagon ride into Millhaven took 40 minutes. Luke sat between Evelyn and Cole on the front bench and narrated everything he saw with the dedicated intensity of someone who had been inside too long, which he had. Cole answered his questions in short, patient sentences. Evelyn listened to them talk and watched the road, and tried not to think about what Millhaven might be like, because she had been through enough towns in the last 14 months to know that towns had long memories and short generosity, and she was not a woman that towns tended to receive warmly. She was right about that. She felt the looks before she registered them consciously, the particular quality of stillness that moves through a crowd when something outside its expectation enters. A woman of her size, her build, walking beside Cole Bennett, who everyone in Millhaven knew was a man alone since Clara died 2 winters ago. She kept her chin level and her steps even, and she did not acknowledge the looks because acknowledging looks only made them worse. The trouble found them at the dry goods store. A woman named Agnes Pratt ran it wide-shouldered and sharp-eyed with the specific social authority of a woman who has been the center of her community's information network for so long that she has confused it with power. She was behind the counter when Cole walked in with Emma and the children, and her eyes went past all of them immediately to Evelyn, and something clicked shut behind her gaze. "Cole Bennett," Agnes said, warm on the surface and cold underneath. "Haven't seen you in a while. These your children?" She already knew they were. Yes, ma'am, Cole said. He put Emma's list on the counter. Agnes looked at the list, looked at the handwriting. 2 sets of handwriting clearly different. Her eyes traveled to Evelyn. And who's this? Evelyn Harper, Evelyn said before Cole could answer. She met the woman's eyes directly. I've been helping with the children. Agnes let a pause live in the air a beat too long. Helping, she repeated. The word came out coded in something that wasn't a question and wasn't a statement, but managed to be both without being either. That's right, Evelyn said. Her voice was pleasant. Her voice was a closed door. Agnes turned to Cole. Cole, I wonder if I might have a word, just neighborly. She glanced at Evelyn. Just between us. Cole looked at the counter. Then he looked at Agnes with the particular expression of a tired man who can see exactly what is being built in front of him and doesn't have the energy to be diplomatic about it. Ma'am, you can say whatever you've got to say with Mrs. Harper standing right here. She's part of my household. The silence that followed that sentence was loud. Agnes put her hands flat on the counter. She kept her voice at a neighborly murmur, which was somehow worse than if she'd raised it. Cole, I just want to say, because I knew Clara. God rest her, and I respect your family folks are talking. A woman nobody knows showing up at a ranch with children, a widower, nobody to account for her character, or her situation. I'm just saying, for the sake of the children's reputation. Their reputation is fine, Cole said. Flat. Final. Cole, the cornmeal and salt are on the list. He tapped the paper on the counter. I'll need those today, please. Agnes looked at him. Then she looked at Evelyn, and her expression moved through several things, embarrassment, resentment, recalibration, before settling on a tight smile that had no warmth anywhere near it. She turned to fill the order. Ruth had pressed herself against Evelyn's side at some point during the exchange. Evelyn became aware of the child's weight against her hip and put her hand on the girl's shoulder without making anything of it. You holding up? She murmured. Ruth looked up at her. She was mean to you. Some people are, Evelyn said quietly. It doesn't change anything. Doesn't it make you want to cry? Evelyn looked down at her. Ruth had asked it with genuine curiosity. No guile, just a child trying to understand how a grown woman stood still while someone was unkind to her. Sometimes, Evelyn said, but not in front of people who are looking for it. Ruth considered this with her characteristic seriousness. Then she took Evelyn's hand and held it, and stood there like that while Agnes Pratt put their goods on the counter, and Evelyn held that small hand and breathed, and kept her face exactly as composed as she'd told Ruth it needed to be. They were outside, and halfway to the wagon, when the second blow landed. It came from a man named Gerald Hatch, who was Millhaven's sole attorney, and held notes on roughly a third of the county's struggling properties, including Evelyn had found in the account books Cole's equipment loan. He was standing outside the barber shop in a good suit that he wore the way men wear armor, and he called out to Cole across the street with his hat in his hand, and his voice pitched at the carrying volume of a man who doesn't mind an audience. Cole, good to see you in town. Was just about to send a man out your way. He came across the street with his hand extended and his eyes moving over the group with a rapid inventory children wagon. Evelyn and something satisfied entered his expression at what he found. Wanted to talk about the Decker note before it turns. Interest accrual's putting you into a hard spot. Figured we should discuss options. He said, discuss options the way you say the corner you've got someone backed into. Cole shook his hand. His own expression hadn't changed, but a muscle in his jaw had moved. I'll come by the office Monday, Gerald. Better sooner than later, Hatch said pleasantly. Clock's running. Then his eyes settled on Evelyn, and he smiled in a way that didn't involve his eyes at all. I don't believe we've met. Evelyn Harper, she said. Hatch. Gerald Hatch. He held out his hand. She shook it because refusing would have given him more than she was willing to give. His grip was the testing kind, the kind that squeezes a little harder than necessary to see what it gets back. You're staying at the Bennett Ranch. Yes, she said. Interesting. He let the word sit. And before that, I came from Crestfield, she said. Before that, Dunmore. And before Dunmore, she looked at him steadily. Before Dunmore is none of your business, Mr. Hatch. Something flickered in his face. Not anger, not quite, but the recognition of a woman who was not going to give him what he was fishing for, and the decision that this would be worth returning to. Well, he put his hat back on. Good to see you, Cole. Monday. He walked away with the unhurried pace of a man who knows he doesn't need to rush because the clock is doing his running for him. Cole stood on the boardwalk and watched him go. He added 3% to that note last month, Cole said. Not loud, not to anyone in particular. I know, Evelyn said. I saw it in the books. It's in the restructuring proposal I wrote out this morning. Cole turned and looked at her. She had left a folded paper on the table that morning before they'd left and told him it was numbers he might find useful on Monday. He hadn't opened it yet. She could see him running the information back through his mind, assembling what she'd just said against what he'd found in the account books she'd rewritten. You wrote a restructuring proposal, he said. 4 pages, she said. Counter-offer on the interest clause payment schedule with a 6-week buffer built in and a written offer on the 2 fence contracts pending over in the valley. If you walk in Monday with that paper in your hand, he knows you've done your math. Men like Hatch only press when they think you haven't. Cole stared at her. Cole, Daniel said, tugging at his father's sleeve. Can we get the penny candy? Cole kept looking at Evelyn for another second. Something was working through his face that she hadn't seen there before, not quite wonder, but close to its neighbor. Then he looked at his son. Yeah, he said. Yeah, we can get the candy. He walked into the general store with the children, and Evelyn stood on the boardwalk and let out the breath she'd been holding since Agnes Pratt's counter, and looked down the main street of Millhaven with its tight little houses and its watching windows, and she thought, I have been here before. Every version of this. Every town. She had thought that thought would be discouraging. Instead, it felt like something settling into place. She was still here. She was always still here. The ride back was quiet in the way that full stomachs and warm sun make children quiet. Ruth fell asleep against Evelyn's arm. Luke had penny candy in his fist and was making it last with extraordinary discipline, one infinitesimal lick at a time. Daniel was in the wagon bed with a comic paper he'd traded 2 of his candies, for which Emma had told him was a terrible trade, and Daniel had said was worth every penny and was already halfway through. Cole drove and didn't talk for a long time. Then, about 10 minutes from the ranch, he said, He'll come after the property. Hatch. Yes, Evelyn said. If I miss the next payment on the Decker note, he's got the right to call the whole thing due, house included. I know. He's been waiting for me to miss it. Cole's hands moved on the reins. I knew that. I just couldn't see the math clearly enough to know how close I was to the line. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. The paper I left on the table, she said. The fence contracts in the valley. Do you know the men who hold them? I know one of them, Bill Tanner. Good man. His regular hand broke his wrist in June. He's been looking for help. If you ride out Monday morning before you go to Millhaven, Evelyn said, and you get Tanner to sign a contract, you can put that signed paper on the table in front of Hatch when you sit down. 2 things happen. First, he knows you have income locked in. Second, he knows you've moved fast enough to secure it before you even talk to him. She paused. Men like Hatch are very impressed by men who move fast. Cole was quiet for a long time. You were a farmer, he said finally. I was. How does a farmer know how to do what you just did? She looked at him sideways. By losing a farm, she said. He said nothing. But he looked at her for a second, really looked at her, and something passed between them that wasn't quite the same as what had been passing between them before. Something that had shifted weight. Something that acknowledged, without either of them being able to say it out loud, that she was not a stranger anymore and hadn't been for several days, and that both of them had stopped pretending otherwise somewhere along the way. Luke had finished his candy down to a red-stained sliver. He held it up toward Evelyn without looking at her. "Last piece," he said. "You can have it." She took it. She put it in her mouth and made a face of absolute delight that was maybe 60% performance and 40% genuine, and Luke grinned so wide she could count every one of his teeth, and Cole made that sound again, that ghost laugh, and this time he didn't bother to look away when he made it. They were almost home when Emma spoke for the first time since Millhaven. "Mrs. Harper." Emma was in the wagon bed, and her voice carried the flat, deliberate tone she used when she had decided to say something she'd been sitting with a long time. "Emma." What Agnes Pratt said. A beat. "Did it hurt?" Evelyn kept her eyes on the road. "Yes," she said. Emma was quiet for a moment. "I thought maybe it didn't. The way you stood there." "Standing still when something hurts isn't the same as it not hurting," Evelyn said. "It just means you've decided your dignity costs more than their satisfaction." Another silence. "My mama used to say something like that," Emma said. Very quietly. The wagon rolled on. The ranch came into view through the scrub oak, and the late afternoon light lay across everything warm and flat. And Evelyn looked at the house that was not her house, the family that was not her family, the man on the bench beside her who was not her anything, and she felt the ground of it under her, steady, complicated, and real. And she pressed it down before it could rise into something she wasn't ready to carry yet. She had been wrong about a lot of things in the last 14 months. She was starting very slowly and with great caution to wonder if she had also been wrong about this. She didn't let herself finish the thought, but she didn't stop it either. That night, after the children were in bed, Cole brought the account books to the table without being asked and sat across from her and opened them. And she moved the lamp between them, and they worked side by side through the numbers for 2 hours without speaking much. And it wasn't until she looked up and found him watching her, instead of the page, that she understood with a clarity that arrived like cold water, that something had already changed between them quietly and without announcement. The way the most important things always changed. He looked back at the page. She looked back at the page. Neither of them said a word about it, but neither of them moved away either. Cole rode out before dawn on Monday. Evelyn heard him go, the particular sound of a man moving quietly through a house so as not to wake anyone. The creak of the back door, the soft fall of boots on packed earth hoofbeats fading toward the valley road. She lay still in the dark and listened until she couldn't hear him anymore. And then she got up and started the bread. He came back at noon with 2 things: Bill Tanner's signature on a 6-week fence contract and a look on his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not relief exactly. Something harder won than relief. The look of a man who had walked into a room expecting to be beaten and had walked out standing. He put the signed paper on the table in front of her without ceremony. "Hatch backed off the interest clause," he said. "Gave me 30 days on the payment schedule instead of 10. Evelyn looked at the contract, then at him. Did he argue? He tried. Cole pulled out the bench and sat down heavily. "Right up until I put Tanner's paper on his desk. Then he got real interested in being reasonable." "They always do," Evelyn said. Cole looked at her across the table. "That paper you wrote, the 4 pages. He paused. "I used most of it word for word." She said nothing. She went back to the bread she was shaping. "Evelyn." He said her given name like he'd been deciding whether to use it and had finally decided. "Thank you." She kept her hands moving in the dough. "You did the work," she said. "I just did the math." "Don't do that," he said quietly. She looked up. "Don't make it small," he said. "What you did." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, receiving it, and went back to the bread, and that was enough. That was more than enough. The days that followed had a rhythm to them that felt cautiously and almost against her will, like something she had lost, and was not sure she deserved to find again. Mornings were hers, the kitchen, the bread. Ruth's small voice asking questions nobody else had the patience to answer. Afternoons, she worked the garden corner which was beginning to show the pale green suggestion of shoots from the bean seeds she'd found in the bottom of a jar in the pantry. Emma came and worked beside her without being asked, not talking much, which was how Emma showed she'd accepted something. Evenings Cole came in and washed at the basin, and they ate together, all 6 of them at the table, and the conversation moved around naturally. Daniel's opinions about everything, Ruth's observations about animals and weather, Luke's non-sequiturs that landed in the middle of other people's sentences, like small bright stones thrown in water. Twice that week, Evelyn caught Cole watching her from across the room with an expression he didn't try to hide when she met his eyes. He just looked at her steadily for a moment and then looked away, and neither of them said anything, and she found she didn't mind. She found she was doing the same thing when he wasn't watching her. She minded that a great deal. She was not ready for that. She wasn't sure she would ever be ready for that. The letter arrived on Thursday. It came with the postwriter who came through the valley every 2 weeks, and it was addressed to Cole, but the return name was one Evelyn didn't recognize Holt out of Billings, and she left it on the table without a second look. Cole read it that evening after supper while the children were doing their lessons. She was washing the supper dishes, and she heard him stop moving. The particular stillness of a man whose body has received information his mind is still catching up to. She turned around. His face was not stone this time. It was something worse than stone. It was the face of a man trying very hard to be stone and not quite managing. Cole. He looked up. He folded the letter slowly, deliberately, like the action required his full concentration. "It's from my wife's brother," he said. "James Holt. Out of Billings." She waited. "Clara's been gone 2 years in September." Cole set the letter flat on the table, his hand resting on it. "James has been looking after Clara's mother since then. The old woman she's not doing well. James wants to come. Bring her here for her last months." He stopped, started again. He also says. Another stop. His jaw moved. He says he's heard some things, about the ranch, about the situation here. Somebody wrote to him. "Agnes Pratt," Evelyn said. It wasn't a question. Cole's eyes came up. "Probably." He moved his hand off the letter. "James is a decent man, but he was very close to Clara, and he has opinions about what's right and what isn't." "What kind of opinions?" Cole was quiet for a moment. Then flatly, "The kind that are going to walk through that door in about 2 weeks and have a lot to say." Emma had looked up from her lessons. She was watching her father with the wide, careful attention of a child who understands adult conversations more completely than adults want her to. Daniel was still bent over his paper. Ruth had stopped writing and was looking at Evelyn. "Is someone coming?" Ruth asked. "Maybe," Cole said. "Uncle James and Grandma Holt." Ruth's expression did something complicated. She had Clara's mother's eyes. Evelyn had been told, without knowing she'd been told, one of those things that gets said in a room and heard by everyone without being directed at anyone. She processed the information and then looked at Evelyn and then back at her father. "Is Mrs. Harper going to leave?" Ruth said. The directness of it landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Cole looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Cole. "Nobody's decided anything," Cole said. His voice was steady. "Everybody back to your work." That night, Evelyn lay awake on her pallet. She'd been given the small back room by the end of the first week quietly, without discussion. Cole just moving her blanket to the room and not saying anything about it. And she ran the arithmetic of her situation the way she would have run an account ledger. Column 1, what she had. Column 2, what she owed. Column 3, what made any kind of sense. Column 3 came up empty. She had no claim here. She had never had any claim here. She had walked through a door that hungry children had opened, and she had stayed because leaving had felt wrong, and she had let herself build something out of 6 loaves of bread and a corner of a dead garden and a 4-page letter to a creditor. And none of that added up to a right to still be in this house when Clara's brother walked through the door with Clara's mother and Clara's grief folded in his luggage alongside his shirts. She got up before dawn and packed her satchel. She was standing at the kitchen table with it in her hand, when Emma appeared in the doorway. Emma looked at the satchel, then at Evelyn. Her face went through something fast and total like a weather change. "No," Emma said. Just that. One word. Flat and absolute. "Emma, no!" Emma crossed the room in 3 steps and took the satchel out of Evelyn's hand. Not rough, deliberate. The way you take something from someone who is about to make a bad decision. She set it on the floor by the wall. "You don't get to just leave." "Emma, your uncle is coming. Your grandmother. I know who's coming." Emma's voice was fierce and low, careful not to wake the house. "I know exactly who's coming and what they're going to say, and I don't care. You don't get to leave because somebody might say something. You told me." Her eyes were burning. "You told me standing still when something hurts means you decided your dignity costs more than their satisfaction. You said that." Evelyn's throat closed. That's different, Emma. How?" Emma's voice cracked just slightly, the one fracture in the wall she'd been holding up for 2 years. "How is it different?" "Because it's you that's scared this time instead of me." The silence stretched between them. Evelyn set her hand on the back of the chair to steady herself. "I'm not scared," she said. It was not true, and Emma knew it, and they both knew the other one knew it. "Papa isn't going to let them push you out," Emma said. Quieter now, the fierceness settling into something more fragile underneath. "He won't. You know he won't." "I don't know that, Emma." "I do." Emma picked up the satchel and put it in the corner behind the woodbox out of sight. "And you'd know it too if you'd stop being so busy being ready to leave that you can't see what's right in front of you." She went back to her room. Evelyn stood in the kitchen alone in the dark with her hands on the back of the chair, and she didn't move for a long time. Cole found her there at dawn. He came in from outside. He'd been to the barn. She could smell the hay on him, and stopped when he saw her standing at the chair instead of working. He looked at the chair, at her hands on it, at her face. "You were going to leave," he said. "I thought about it." "What stopped you?" She looked at him across the room. "Your daughter took my bag." Something moved through his face, startled, then something warmer, then something that settled into the kind of quiet that means a man is making a decision he's already made, but is just now acknowledging. He came to the table and sat down and put both hands flat on it, the way he did when he was about to say something he'd been carrying a while. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about Clara." She sat down. He talked for 20 minutes. He talked about a woman who had been good and brave and sick for longer than anyone had known, who had kept her illness from him for 8 months, because she didn't want him to stop looking at her, the way he looked at her, who had died in October 2 years ago, with his hand in both of hers, and Ruth's head on the bed beside her. He talked about the 18 months after the weight of the children, the weight of the land, the weight of knowing that being broken was a luxury he could not afford. He talked about it the way a man talks about something he has carried alone so long that the telling of it is itself a kind of relief, a setting down. When he finished, the kitchen was fully lit with morning. Evelyn said, "She sounds like she was remarkable." "She was," Cole said. "She was." He looked at his hands on the table. Then he looked up. "She would have liked you. I'm not saying that to say anything beyond what it is. I just think it's true. She would have liked how you moved through a room. She would have liked what you said to Agnes Pratt. The ghost of something. She would have absolutely loved that 4-page letter." Evelyn laughed. A real laugh surprised out of her. It sounded strange in her own ears, like a door opening that had been shut a long time. Cole smiled. A real one. She had not seen a full smile on him before, and it changed his face so completely that for a moment she almost didn't recognize him. The moment held. Then, Luke's voice came from down the hall, the particular pre-dawn wail of a child who has woken in the dark and found himself alone. "Papa." Cole stood up. He was at the hallway door when he stopped and looked back at her. "James Holt is going to come," he said. "He's going to have opinions, and I'm going to tell him clearly and plainly what the situation is and what it isn't and what I intend. If he doesn't like it, he paused. He doesn't have to like it. Cole, Evelyn, her name in his mouth plain and direct. Don't pack the bag again. He went down the hall to Luke. She sat at the table in the morning light with her hands folded in front of her, and she breathed, and she did not pack the bag, and she did not think ahead too far, and she started the bread. James Holt arrived on a Tuesday 11 days later in a hired wagon with his mother-in-law Margaret Holt propped beside him on the seat like something fragile that had survived a long journey, mostly through stubbornness. He was a broad man with Clara's coloring and Clara's way of looking at a room as though taking inventory, and he took inventory of Evelyn with a thoroughness and lack of subtlety that would have been rude if he'd been trying to be rude, and was worse because he wasn't. He was just a man who had loved his sister and was trying to understand what he was looking at. Margaret Holt was 73 years old and had the particular vitality of very old women who have survived everything and decided to keep going anyway. She looked at Evelyn from the wagon seat with sharp, clear eyes and said, "You're the widow Baker." "Harper," Evelyn said. "Evelyn Harper. Yes, ma'am." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "Clara wrote to me about wanting someone like you," she said, "before she died. Said she worried about the children having a woman to show them things." She said it without sentimentality, just as information. She'd be satisfied. James Holt's jaw moved. He looked at his mother, then at Evelyn, then at Cole, who had come down off the porch and was standing beside Evelyn with his arms at his sides, and his face set in the quiet, immovable way that meant he had already decided and was waiting to see if anyone was going to make something of it. "Cole," James said. "James," Cole said. A long look passed between them, the kind that contains an entire conversation, and James looked at Evelyn again, and this time the inventory was a different kind. Still careful, but different. "I'll get Mother's trunk," James said finally. He climbed down from the wagon. Cole looked at Evelyn. She looked at him. Luke had come out of the house and crossed the porch and was standing at Evelyn's side with his hand in hers, and he looked up at James Holt with the direct, trusting gaze of a boy who has decided something and sees no reason to explain it. "She makes bread," Luke told James. Like that settled everything. James looked at the boy. Something in his expression shifted from the careful, guarded thing it had been into something less defended, less armored. "Does she?" he said. "The best bread," Luke said. "Even better than Mama's." He paused with the particular solemnity of a child amending an important statement. "Almost." James Holt stood there for a moment, Clara's brother with his sister's face looking up at him from his nephew's eyes, and something crossed his expression that took the starch right out of him, not all at once, but enough. Enough to see what was underneath it. He looked at Cole. "You got a place I can put this trunk?" "Back room," Cole said. And then after a beat, "Welcome home, James." James Holt was not an easy man to have in a house. He was not cruel, and he was not unkind, but he had opinions. The way some men have whether constant present, and not particularly interested in whether you'd asked for them. He watched Evelyn move through the kitchen the first morning with the focused attention of a man compiling evidence. And when she set bread on the table, he ate 2 slices without comment and then said to Cole, "How long has she been here?" 3 weeks, Cole said. "And before that, she was where exactly?" "James." Cole's voice carried one note of warning, quiet and clear. James looked at his coffee. "I'm just asking." "You're not just asking," Cole said. "You're building toward something. Build toward it directly or don't build toward it at all." A silence. Margaret Holt, sitting at the end of the table with her hands wrapped around her cup and her sharp eyes moving between the 2 men, made a small sound that might have been approval. James set his cup down. "Fine. Directly." He looked at Cole. "What is your intention here regarding Mrs. Harper?" The kitchen went very still. Emma had stopped moving at the shelf. Ruth was watching her father. Even Luke, who normally provided a running commentary on everything happening around him, had gone quiet. Cole looked at James across the table for a long moment. "My intention," Cole said, "is my business. and hers. He glanced at Evelyn, and in that glance was something she felt all the way through her. Not an apology for the question. Not embarrassment. Just a steady acknowledgement that she was part of the answer, and he knew it. "When there's something to tell you, I'll tell you." James opened his mouth. "James," Margaret said. Not loud, just his name said the way mothers say names when they mean stop. James closed his mouth. He did not stop watching, but he stopped asking, and that was enough for one morning. The days shaped themselves around the new configuration of the house, with the grinding, gradual adjustment of people who have no choice but to make room. James took on the fence work without being asked, riding out with Cole each morning, and whatever passed between the two men on those long days on the fence line, it seemed to work something loose. James came back the second evening less armored. The third evening, he brought Ruth a wildflower he'd found along the eastern ridge, and handed it to her with the awkward tenderness of a man who has forgotten how to be easy with children and is trying to remember. Margaret was a different matter entirely. She did not adjust to the house. The house adjusted to her. She moved slowly, and with great deliberateness, and she said exactly what she thought at all times, and what she thought was frequently more honest than comfortable. The second day, she sat beside Evelyn at the kitchen table, while Evelyn worked the bread dough, and watched in silence for 10 minutes, and then said, "You're overworking it." Evelyn looked at her. "I know," she said. "I do it when I'm thinking too hard about other things." Margaret nodded. "What are you thinking too hard about?" "Whether I'm wanted here or whether I'm just needed," Evelyn said. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. It arrived already spoken. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Those aren't the same thing," she said. "No," Evelyn said. "They're not." "Which do you want to be?" Evelyn looked at the dough under her hands. "Both," she said, quietly. "I'd like to be both." Margaret looked at her for a long time. Then she put her hand dry and light, and very sure of itself over Evelyn's on the dough, and pressed down once. "Then stop overworking the bread," she said, "and stop waiting for someone to tell you that you belong here. Belonging isn't told, it's taken." She got up slowly, and went to sit in the chair by the window, and she didn't say another word about it, and she didn't need to. Cole found Evelyn in the garden that afternoon, both hands in the soil checking the bean shoots that had come up another inch overnight. He crouched at the edge of the bed, his arms resting on his knees, and looked at the green line of growth without speaking for a moment. "James asked me last night," Cole said. "After you'd gone to bed." Evelyn kept her hands in the soil. "Asked you what?" "Whether I was in love with you." The air between them went completely still, a long beat. She did not look up. "What did you tell him?" she said. Cole was quiet for exactly long enough that the silence became its own answer. "I told him I hadn't said it out loud yet," he said, "but that the not saying it wasn't because it wasn't true." She sat back on her heels. Now she looked at him. He was looking at her the way he'd been looking at her for days straight and steady and without apology, the way he did everything. "Cole, I'm not asking you for anything right now," he said. "I'm not asking you to say anything back or decide anything. I just thought you should know what I said to James because you're the one it was about, and it seemed wrong for you to be the last one to hear it." He stood up, brushed the dust off his knees. "That's all." He went back toward the barn. Evelyn stayed in the garden with her hands in the soil, and the bean shoots standing up green and stubborn in their corner of surviving earth, and she pressed her fingers into the ground and breathed through it. The enormity of it, the terror of it. The thing inside her chest that had been building for weeks and was now sitting right at the surface, warm and insistent, and entirely unwilling to be managed. She was still there when Emma appeared. Emma sat down at the edge of the garden bed without asking. She pulled a weed, pulled another, said nothing. Evelyn said, "Did you hear that?" "I was behind the barn," Emma said. "I wasn't trying to." And Emma pulled a third weed and threw it toward the fence with more force than necessary. "I think you should tell him," she said. Whatever you're sitting there not saying, I think you should just tell him. Emma, it's not that simple. Why not? Emma's voice came out fiercer than she'd probably intended, the way Emma's voice always did when she had decided something and needed the other person to catch up. You've been here a month. You fixed our books and our garden and our bread and our arithmetic. You stood on a street corner and didn't flinch when Agnes Pratt was horrible. You took my bag when I was leaving, and you told me that your dignity costs more than other people's satisfaction. She stopped. Her jaw was tight. You taught me that. So stop letting your own fear cost you something. The silence held. When did you get this smart? Evelyn said. I've always been this smart, Emma said. You're just the first person who treated me like I was. Evelyn looked at the girl. This girl who had opened a door 3 inches on the worst day of her young life and made room anyway. This girl who had braced herself between the world and her brothers and sister for 2 years on sheer stubbornness and love, and she felt something open in her chest, the way a window opens. Wide. Sudden. Letting in all the air at once. Your mama would be so proud of you, Evelyn said. It came out whole and direct and entirely unplanned. Emma's face did something she clearly hadn't prepared for. The wall held, but something behind it moved, shifted, became briefly visible. Grief and love, and the long ache of a 13-year-old girl who had been acting like a woman for too long and sometimes forgot she didn't have to. She didn't cry. She was Emma. But her eyes went bright, and her chin went up, and she said very quietly, Yeah, Evelyn said. Absolutely, and without question. Emma nodded once, pressed her lips together, nodded again. Then she got up, brushed off her knees the same way her father had, and went inside without another word. Evelyn watched her go, and held on to herself very carefully for a minute, until she was sure she could stand up without her legs being unreliable. She found Cole at the barn. He was mending a bridle sitting on the rail, and he looked up when she came in, and then looked back at the bridle, giving her the choice of how to begin. That was something she had come to understand about him. He always gave her the choice. He never pushed through a door she hadn't opened. She opened the door. You said you hadn't said it out loud yet, she said. To James. Cole's hands went still on the bridle. But you haven't said it to me either, she said. A long beat. Cole set the bridle down on the rail and looked at her. Fully. The way he'd been looking at her from the beginning, straight and clear, and without any of the performance that other men use to fill space. He had never once used performance. That was what had gotten to her first, she realized. Before the children, before the accounts, before any of it. The complete absence of pretense. I love you, he said. Plain as weather, plain as bread on a table, like it had always been true, and he'd only been waiting for the right moment to say it aloud. Evelyn breathed in. I have been afraid, she said, every single day since Robert died, that I would never stop feeling like someone who was between places, like someone passing through. She paused. I have been afraid that I was here because you needed me, and not because... She stopped, started again. I have been afraid that the door would close. The door's not closing, Cole said. I know that now. She looked at him. I love you too. I have for a while. I was just very busy being terrified of it. Cole got down from the rail. He crossed to her in 3 steps and put his hands on either side of her face, careful and sure, and looked at her for one more long moment, the way he did everything like she was worth the time of seeing properly. Then he kissed her. Brief, warm, real. When he pulled back, his forehead came down to rest against hers, and they stood like that in the quiet of the barn and breathed. Stay, he said. Yes, she said. No hesitation. No column 3. Just yes. The day Cole Bennett asked Evelyn Harper to marry him was not a dramatic day. It was a Tuesday in late August. The beans in the garden had come in enough to make a proper pot of soup, and Luke had a cold, and had been following Evelyn around the house all morning with a blanket around his shoulders, like a small, miserable emperor. Cole had come in at midday, washed at the basin, sat down at the table, and said while she was cutting bread, and Luke was leaning against her hip, "Marry me, Evelyn." She set down the knife. Luke looked up at her, then at his father, then back at her. "Say yes," Luke said with the decisive authority of a person whose opinion had never once been in doubt. Ruth appeared from the hallway. "What happened?" "Papa asked Mrs. Harper to marry him," Luke reported. Ruth clasped both hands together in front of her chest and looked at Evelyn with an expression of concentrated hope, so intense it was almost painful. "Say yes," Ruth said. "You haven't let me answer yet," Evelyn said. "We already know the answer," Luke said. From the doorway, Emma's voice came dry and 17 going on 40. "They're not wrong." Evelyn looked at Cole across the table. He was watching her with that quiet, steady look, not anxious, not pushing, just present, just himself. The same man who had pulled out a bench for a stranger because she hadn't eaten, who had sat with account books for 2 hours so his children wouldn't lose their home, who had told his brother-in-law plainly and without apology that the woman in his house was part of his answer. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." Luke threw both arms in the air. Ruth made a sound that was half laugh and half something she'd been holding for a long time. Daniel appeared from nowhere, as Daniel always did, having apparently been in the house the whole time without anyone noticing, and said, "Finally," with such theatrical relief that Cole looked at him and said, "You knew." "Papa, everybody knew," Daniel said. "Even the horse." James Holt, who had come in behind Daniel and had very clearly also known, said nothing. He looked at Evelyn across the room with an expression that had finished its journey from suspicion through reluctance, all the way to something that was not quite warm yet, but was pointed in warmth's direction. He gave her one short nod. She gave him one back. That was enough. That was exactly enough. Margaret, sitting in her chair by the window, did not look surprised. She looked satisfied in the deep, settled way of a very old woman who has been right about something important and has the grace not to say so out loud. The wedding was small. The second Saturday of September, in the yard between the house and the garden, with the bean plants standing behind them, and a preacher from the next valley who charged $3 and shook Cole's hand so hard after that, Cole flexed his fingers twice on the walk back. James stood beside Cole. Emma stood beside Evelyn, straight-backed and dry-eyed and magnificent. Ruth held a bunch of wildflowers that she'd gathered herself at dawn, which she presented to Evelyn, with a ceremony that suggested she had been planning the gesture for some time. Luke stood in front of everyone, having appointed himself to a position no one had assigned him, and watched the whole proceeding with the focused reverence of a child witnessing something he understands to be important. Agnes Pratt was not invited. Gerald Hatch was not invited. The people who had looked at Evelyn on that boardwalk and found her wanting were not invited and did not come. The people who came were the people who had been paying attention, Bill Tanner and his wife, the family from the North Ridge, who had brought soup when Clara died and never stopped checking in the schoolteacher who had noticed Emma's arithmetic improving and had walked out 3 miles to say so. When the preacher said the words, and Cole took her hand, Evelyn held on to it and thought of a road she had been walking for 14 months, carrying 6 loaves of bread and the weight of every door that had been closed in her face. And she thought of the moment she had stopped on that road and turned toward the sound of children crying, when every sensible thing in her said to keep walking. She thought of a door open 3 inches. She thought of a small boy holding a piece of bread in both hands, making sure it was real before he let himself believe it. She understood standing in that yard that the bread had not been something she gave away. It had been something she carried until she found the place it was meant to be. Cole squeezed her hand. She looked at him. He was already looking at her. That evening, with the yard cleared and the children in bed, Luke having fallen asleep before his head fully reached the pillow, one hand still wrapped around a leftover wedding biscuit. Evelyn sat at the table in the kitchen that was now her kitchen, in the house that was now her house, and she listened to the sounds of it settling around her in the dark. Cole's boots at the door, Margaret's slow breathing from the back room, the creak of Emma's floor as the girl finally let herself sleep. She had walked through a door that nobody wanted to let her through. She had stood still when it hurt and kept moving when everything said stop, and she had not once let anyone's cruelty convince her that she was worth less than she was. She had carried herself through 14 months of closed doors and flat roads and empty pantries, and the particular loneliness of a woman that the world keeps trying to make small, and she had arrived finally, not in spite of who she was, but entirely because of it, to a table with bread on it, and a family around it, and a man who had said her name, like it was worth saying, right from the very first day. Some women the world breaks. Some women it only makes more certain of themselves. Evelyn Harper had always known which kind she was. Now at last the world knew it too.